everyone, the release of Diablo 4 is very quickly approaching us, and I wanted to make some build guides on some sorcerer builds, as this will be the class I'll be playing on launch, and wanted to give people some options on leveling builds if they wanted a little bit of help of getting into the game with the typical Allie polish that I give onto guides, or at least as much of it as I can with the resources that we currently have and with the inability to realistically test all this. With that said, I do want to say that this is going to use a little bit of assumptions, as we have not been able to play past level 25 and we've only been able to play the first act in all the betas. So some of this is going to be a little bit of unknown, but all of this should be fine and it really shouldn't be that big of a problem. So let me talk about the first builds that I have for you guys. So this is going to be a very interesting build based around charged bolts. This was a skill that was buffed in the final patch of the game, and there could be one more patch before the game fully releases, but I doubt that will actually happen with there only being a few days left. So this most likely is going to be the version of charged bolts and the version of sorcerer that we have on launch. So the thing that changed about charged bolts that made it go from a skill that everyone kind of just ignored to a skill that suddenly is really good is the mana cost going from 40 to 30, which is a pretty massive decrease, and it allows us to potentially see it as a single target skill as is. So what charge bolts does is it will release 5 bolts of lightning that will randomly move around. If you've played Path of Exile, you can think of this as Spark from Path of Exile. It's basically the same thing. The interesting thing about these is if you're standing on top of something, all 5 bolts can actually hit the same target, basically 5xing your damage. With that in mind, Charge Bolt is actually the single highest damaging skill in the game. The only downside is we do have to be right up next to enemies to be able to benefit from that, but this build is going to be centered around being really tanky and not really caring, and if anything, benefiting from the fact that we're going to be near enemies. So all of this is going to be based off of 2 enchantments for sorcerers. We get a enchantment at level 15 and we get a second slot at level 30. And once we get our second slot, that is when this build will be in full power. What we will be doing is using the Charge Bolt enchantment, which gives us a 40% chance to create 4 Charge Bolts for free when we stun an enemy. Now, this does not have any sort of downside, and that means if we stun 5 enemies at the same time, they all have a 40% chance to release a bolt, meaning we can get quite a lot of AoE from this and quite a lot of burst damage from this if we stun enemies in a small room, and if the charged bolts bounce around and hit other enemies. The way we're going to be generating all these stuns is through the Arc Lash enchantment. When you use a cooldown, enemies around you are stunned for half a second. Now that might seem like a very tiny amount of time, but at the end of the day, it's still a stun, which means charged bolts will proc. Because of this, and because the stun is such a low duration, that means we can spam quite a lot of cooldowns, get a lot of small hits, and generate a very large amount of charged bolts. We're going to be pairing this with some low cooldowns, such as teleports, which I feel like is just mandatory to include in every build, simply because it's such a good utility skill for SORC, and Flame Shield, which again, I feel like is mandatory in every SORC build. This gives you 2 seconds of straight up immunity to damage, and with the passive points we'll be picking up on it, will make us heal for half of our missing life, giving us a very good way to sustain, and give us movement speed while it's active, allowing us to use it as a movement speed button whenever we don't need it, and to use it as an O-ship button, which also gives us a little bit of movement speed to be able to get away from any dangerous situations. We're lastly going to be also using Ice Armor. This is going to be a 20-second cooldown shield that at max level will give us almost half of our life as a barrier. We can also benefit from this to gain some more effects while we have barriers on us. And between these 3 skills, we can spam out quite a lot of stuns for Arc Lash. The other thing to mention as well for Arc Lash is that it itself will stun all enemies for 2 seconds every 10 Arc Lashes. And if Arc Lash crits, we will get 2 hits of Arc Lash every time. This means if we stack attack speed, which is very easy to do as is a basic skill, and if we stack critical strike chance, we can get quite a lot of procs just from Arc Lash on its own. Between all these, we should be able to generate quite a lot of cooldowns for the enchantment, which should give us quite a lot of charge bolts. Realistically, you should be able to actually mostly clear most mobs by just simply teleporting on top of them or just teleporting in place, which will stun everything around you since the cooldown, and just spamming 1 or 2 Arc Lashes to either finish everything off or actually just pressing Charge Bolt itself, since we don't have anything else that requires mana in this build. So we can dump all of our mana into just spamming Charge Bolts. In terms of the gear for this, now these are all aspects that you will be getting throughout your leveling experience, with the exception of 2. These are mostly just generic things that will either make you a little bit tankier or have you gain a little bit of movement speed. The most important one here is going to be Rapid Aspect, which we can get from doing Buried Halls and Dried Steps. This would be something I would recommend for you to immediately go and rush, as it would give you up to 30% increased attack speed on your basic skills, which Arc Lash is a basic skill. Having 30% attack speed is going to allow you to get to 10 hits a lot faster to get free stuns, which is going to be your filler whenever you don't have any mana to press Charge Bolts on a boss. And it's going to help you fill in any points where you might not have any cooldowns up. The final skill to mention in all of this is Unstable Currents. This is going to be your big cooldown, and this honestly might just be a really stupid burst button on specific bosses. For 10 seconds, whenever you cast a shock skill, which means we'll be pressing Unstable Currents, then spamming as many Charge Bolts as we can, and then spamming as many Arc Lashes to fill in the rest of the duration. So for those 10 seconds of us spamming these 2 skills, we will be casting a random shock skill. Now that means it will either pick a Chain Lightning, a Charge Bolt, a Lightning Spear, or a Ball Lightning to do. And the nice thing here is that Lightning Spear is a cooldown, which means we will be generating stuns around us. Not only that, but Unstable Currents is going to give us 25% increased attack speed while it's active, which means we can do even more abilities. Every 70 seconds, we're just going to press this, and we should either be generating a hell of a lot more free Charge Bolts, a bunch of free Chain Lightnings, which also do great damage because it's 36% times 5 as it'll bounce around. Give us free cooldowns, or Lightning Spears in general, which give us great damage, or Ball Lightnings, which are okay damage as well. Basically meaning we can do a lot of burst damage simply from the abilities themselves. But if we do end up getting lucky and get a lot of Lightning Spears, and for example, let's say there's a boss with adds, we can stun all those adds, which means we'll generate even more free Charge Bolts, potentially giving us really insane bursts. The final thing to cap this whole build is going to be the mastery that we pick, Veer's Mastery, because we want to be in close range. Veer's Mastery is perfect for this build since we get 10% increased damage, and enemies do 20% less damage to us. And if we crit, these bonuses are going to be increased by 25%, which is quite a lot of extra DR. Being at 25% permanent less damage taken is going to be wonderful for bosses. And when we stack it with our barrier from Ice Armor, we are going to be very, very tanky, and we shouldn't have much of an issue living most things. Last thing to mention is going to be the little bit of scaling that we'll be picking up. We'll be picking up Coursing Currents down here, which gives us critical strike chance. That resets when we hit a crit. This will be very good for early games to put 3 points in here while we have low crit chance, but eventually we will want to only have 1 point left in this just to be able to get to electrocution, which makes enemies deal 15% less damage for 5 seconds after being critically struck by a shock skill. Between this 15% less damage and the Veer's Mastery 25% less damage, assuming we crit, we already have a stupid amount of DR between these 2 items. There's also a legendary that we can eventually get, which will give us 20% damage reduction when we use a basic skill. So between us just sitting here and spamming Arc Lash and critting with it, we will have a free 60% damage reduction, which should make us extremely tanky and give us absolutely no problems with being on top of enemies when we combine it with our great set of utility skills. Why don't we quickly talk about how you would level this and how you would get to the point in which you can play this build. Now, because I did not test the Charge Bolts change on beta, I'm not going to be able to give you an exact answer of if you can just immediately play Charge Bolts, but the overall theme of what we need to do here is we need to get to level 30. At level 30, we'll get both our enchantments, and that is when we can fully have the build come online. Until then, what we're going to be doing is we'll just be playing Arc Lash, and we'll be playing Charge Bolts as their own standalone abilities. If we want to look at a new level 1 character, we can look at how I would be pathing this myself and how I'd get to level 30. So first, we'd have to put 2 points into Arc Lash. Arc Lash is actually pretty decent at low level and should do a good job clearing. We don't want to pick up the Enchanted Arc Lash because this isn't going to really proc that often. We only have a 5% base crit chance. So until we get more crit items later on, we can't really scale this very high. Once we've done this, we are going to want to immediately put at least 3 or 4 levels into Charge Bolts. Now, if you feel like you can't really get enough of this, you can go 3 and 3 and then have more of a Arc Lash based build. until you can get some mana regen. But if you just want some big bursts, you can just go 4 points. The point is we just need to get to our third set of skills. Once we get here, we're going to immediately pick up teleports. Teleports just way too good not to have. And we're going to be picking up ice armor with the 25% increased mana regeneration node on it to allow us to spam more charge bolts. At this point, our build is going to be ice armor on cooldown and then spamming as many charge bolts as we can. If this doesn't feel good, your other option is instead to go for chain lightning. I've leveled quite a bit of chain lightning. Now they have nerfed damage of it by over half, but it should still feel okay to play with if you aren't a fan of charge bolts and the mana cost of it. But honestly, I feel like charge bolts should be more than fine on its own. At this point, once we have the mana regeneration node, we can look to picking up enhanced charge bolts, which makes it so if we hit 3 enemies at the same time, we'll do a Nova. This Nova for 24% more damage would give us more damage than if we put another point into charge bolts. And we can look to now pick up the 5th points in charge bolts and potentially either pick up the damage reduction that charge bolts will give us if we hit an enemy with it, or we can pick up the 25% increased damage to stun enemies, which won't really be that good early on, but it will shine once we get to level 30. So for now, I just recommend to pick up the DR, but you could pick this up if you want a little bit more damage, but you would have to time it with your arc lash, which might not really be worth it. From here, we're also going to be picking up a point in flame shield. Now you could do this earlier if you wanted to, if you want to have flame shield early on, but if not, this is the time to finally pick it up. And then from here, just because we really shouldn't have much of a problem with anything, we just put 3 points into glass cannon, which will give us 18% more damage, but will make us take 9% more damage. Between flame shield and ice armor, you shouldn't really have too many problems. But if you feel you're a little bit too squishy, what you could do at this point is pick up 1 point of Align the Elements. This will give us DR, but we don't really care about this. This node has been nerfed way too hard. And this will allow us to pick up Protection. Using a cooldown grants a 10% of your max life barrier for 2 seconds. We could also just choose to put 3 points into this, which gives us 30% shield every time we press teleport, every time we press flame shield, and every time we press ice armor. Between all of that, it should feel pretty good to run glass cannon, and you shouldn't have too much of a problem. From here, we do need to spend a few more points because we need to get to unstable currents. So at this point, what you can do is you can either put points into enchanted flame shield for movement speed, and then the heal. Or if you want to just zoop around a little bit faster, you can pick up the first point in teleports to make it give you CDR if you hit enemies with it, and then just put some points into teleport. I'm going to personally probably put a point into this and then pick up the movement speed, since having cooldown teleports and having movement speed is going to be how you can do the campaign faster, and that's going to be substantially more important. If I feel like I'm tanky enough, I probably would personally also just not pick up the points in protection yet. And so I just opt to put 5 points into teleport, which massively reduces the cooldown of it, which means I can massively get through the story faster. And then for the final points, I'll most likely just be picking up the heal, just because we are kind of squishy and we wouldn't have a very good way of staying alive without this point. At this point, we can finally pick up unstable currents and pick up the point of attack speed in it. Between these two, you should have 0 problems being able to kill bosses, and you will have a very, very easy time through the rest of the campaign just with this button alone, as Lightning Spear does quite a lot of damage, and so does Charge Bolts and Chain Lightning. The final thing we're worried about getting at this point is getting down to Fierce Mastery, since this is just an immediate damage boost and a less damage taken. From here, personally, I would look to pick up a few more points of passives, and I think personally I would most likely go with Align the Elements and finally get Protection. At this point, we are going to be very close to level 30. So once we are level 30, we are ready to have our build online, as we can run both of the enchantments for this build. So to do that, we would simply just swap out our enchantment to Arc Lash and our enchanted to Charge Bolts. And before this point, what I would recommend is to just pick up the Chain Lightning Mastery at level 15. This makes it so you do a free Chain Lightning every 100 mana, and even a level 1 Chain Lightning with no points in it does quite a lot of damage, which will give you quite a little bit of extra DPS. You can also choose, if you feel really, really scared, or if you're playing hardcore, to instead pick up the Flame Shield enchantment as soon as you can, which gives you a cheat death every 2 minutes. For hardcore, I would say this is a must, but if you're playing in softcore, I would just say to pick up the Chain Lightning enchantment until then. At this point, to fill out the rest of our points, we can now choose to swap over to the other Charge Bolt Mastery, which makes us do 25% increased damage to stun enemies instead of having the damage reduction, but this is up to you. If you do want more damage, is going to be a better option. And we can now look into scaling crit chance. So the first thing we would do is picking up 3 points in coursing currents, which would give us 3% crit chance every time we attack, which would allow us to crit a little bit more often. And we can start putting points into electrocution, which is just a lot of DR. As soon as we pick up a point, we're ready to pick up Fierce Mastery. And from here, we just fill out the tree with the rest of the points that are missing. So we put 2 more points in electrocution to be very tanky. We would go up and pick up the last few points in Arc Lash we need. But first, we would most likely pick Enhance Arc Lash because we are starting to scale crit. Hopefully you find a little bit of crit gear at this point. So we should be getting the double Arc Lashes quite often. And then we should pick up the stuns. Give us reduced cooldowns when we stun specifically with Arc Lash, as we'll be doing double Arc Lashes quite often, which will allow us to get to 10 stacks pretty quickly, which will mean we'll get a little bit of cooldown off of Arc Lash pretty reasonably. By this point at level 40, you most likely will have gotten yourself the increased attack speed aspect, which will mean you will be Arc Lashing pretty quickly, which should mean that this should be proccing quite often, which will give you a decent amount of extra CDR. From here, if we want to get tankier, we can also pick up the 30% damage reduction for 5 seconds after teleporting, and we just simply fill in the rest of the passive points to make our tree look something like this. I think, in my opinion, this build is going to be disgustingly strong, absolutely disgustingly strong. Between the DR from teleports, between the DR that you can get from charge bolts, between all of the stunning you'll be doing, between all of the damage reduction that you'll be picking up, between your barrier, your immunity, and between all of the legendary passives that you'll have, you basically are going to take no damage, and you will have charge bolts in your builds, which is the strongest SORC skill in the game. Now, once we get to tier 3 and once we get to level 50, if this build still feels good to play and you want to continue with it, there is some things you can be on the lookout for to make this build absolutely broken. So the first thing to look for would be the 2 legendary powers for this build that would give you a stupid amount of damage. Now, unfortunately, these cannot be gotten as a guaranteed item from either doing a dungeon or progressing the story. And that is Stable Aspect and Aspect of Overwhelming Currents. These are going to be random drops, and I can see these being worth quite a lot of money. So let's start with Stable Aspect. If you do get this, you want to put this on your weapon to make it twice as strong. When Unstable Currents is not active, you have a up to 10% chance to trigger a free cast from it. Now, if you put this in a weapon, it will double whatever your percent is. So if you get a max rolled Stable Aspect, that means you'll have a 20% chance every time you press charge bolts and every time you place Arc Lash that you will proc Unstable Currents for free. A 20% chance at this, especially when you'll be Arc Lashing super fast, means you'll be getting quite a lot of free procs for the Arc Lash enchant. The other one is the Aspect of Overwhelming Currents. Currents has a 20% chance to cast an additional shock skill at a max roll. We're going to be putting this into an amulet to make it 50% stronger. So if you get a max roll, you have a 30% chance to cast an additional shock skill. That just means your cooldown is going to be 30% stronger. It's going to be 30% burst here, and it should give you some quite insane outcomes. I would, if you had the money and if you want to keep playing this build and invest into it, attempt to buy Stable Aspect first from the auction house if you are looking to purchase this, and then get Overwhelming Currents afterwards, as Stable Aspect is going to make your clearing and your leveling a lot more convenient. And it's going to be more important to pick up. Now, the other thing, which is what is making me think this build will most likely be the speed build for SORC, is going to be the legendary chest armor that we can actually get for this build, which is going to be the Remnant of Infinite. After using teleport, close enemies are pulled to you and stunned for a few seconds, but teleport's cooldowns increase by 20%. So what this means is that if I were to teleport in place, I would get 2 procs of the stun for Arc Lash, which would give me quite a lot of charge bolts. And I can simply just use teleport as a way to quickly clear. Now, one thing I am not certain on is I do not know where the Arc Lash stun will proc when you use teleport. I don't know if it'll be where you are standing when you use teleport or where you arrive when you use teleport. If it's where you arrive, then this chest plate is going to be completely broken, because we're going to assume here that if you overlap stuns, each stun is going to count as its own stun, meaning every time you teleport on top of a pack, you will do 2 separate stuns, meaning you have 2 separate procs at charge bolts, 40% chance to release charge bolts. This means that we can get quite a lot of clear speed by just simply teleporting around and killing packs basically instantly. We'll be killing them in half a second as soon as we teleport them. The other thing that could make this potentially really strong is getting the charge bolts legendary. Your cast of charge bolts have a chance to be attracted to enemies and last 300% longer. Now, we will have to see if this works with the automatic procs of charge bolts, but if it does, static cling will be a really good addition to your build and will be something that you might want to be on the lookout for as well. Nice thing about this is it's a guaranteed drop from doing a dungeon. So if it actually ends up being good, then it'll be very easy for you to get your hands on this. The other thing which you might want to consider is going to be the staff of Lam Esen. I don't think this is going to be very good. Charge bolts pierce, but deal up to 30% less damage if you get a max roll of it. This might make it good for clear. And depending on how charge bolts work, if it works with static cling, and for example, we can have a charge bolt go through an enemy and then static cling have it be turning the bolts around and making them attack again. Basically, if the pierce allows us to hit multiple times with charge bolts, then this build becomes broken. If the attraction doesn't work again, or if the charge bolts can't bounce off of walls or off of other things and hit the same target again, then the staff is going to be kind of useless. So unfortunately, we'll have to see how that works. This is not an item that was obtainable in beta, so I can't tell you how good it is. Either way, that's all I really have to say. I will provide a link to this build in the description below if you want to look at a static version of it. Unfortunately, there's no way for me to show you a way to level this other than simply just going back in the video and just looking at the discussion I had about how to put your points in it. But if you just want a full setup for what this would look like at level 50, this is available for you there. If you guys end up playing this build, I hope you have fun with it and I hope it works out well. And if this is not your kind of build, I will have one more build guide for the start of the Diablo release on a firewall based SORC setup. That's all I have for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And if you play this build, I hope you have fun with it. And I will see you guys in the next video. If you have any more questions, please feel free to leave them down in the comments below.